Well, we saw the overall results for countries, the key attributes that are put together to make an overall index. You saw earlier on in the day that I talked through the 8 pillars, various different pillars that can be used for government policy to develop soft power. There's a lot of rich data to understand how countries are doing. We've then got into one or two of the individual areas, like sustainability, like sport. The final session, between now and 5 o'clock, is going to be looking at the pillar of governance. Governance is a key issue because it represents whether or not a country is an attractive place to live and feel at home, and that sends out a message to the outside world. Here in the UK, for example, devolution, which happened under Tony Blair, resulted in greater independence in Scotland and Wales. And I think it's fair to say, although it's caused a little bit of disharmony and argument that Boris was talking about, it's actually been a very good thing because it means that people at the grassroots level have a say in their own environment, in the laws and so on that affect them in particular. I don't suppose they expected that by doing that they would end up with an endless debate about Scottish independence, but I think possibly that one has come to an end. But what it meant was that the governance structure of the UK has been more friendly towards minorities and other people with an interest. And so one of the things that I'm particularly interested in, it's been interesting us since we began thinking about the monarchy. You may know that a few years ago we actually did a valuation of the monarchy to say what it contributed to the UK economy. That is obviously a major tool of soft power, whether you agree with the principle of monarchy or not. And one of the big questions about the monarchy, which we've touched on during the day, is what will happen to the Commonwealth. And so what we are going to do in this next session is start at a more grassroots level with an individual country, being Australia, talk about some of the issues that are bubbling to the surface in Australia, long overdue, I have to say. And then, once we've had that discussion about Australia, the final session of the day will be Lord Ed Vaizey, who is going to come and talk about what does this all mean at a broader level for the UK and the Commonwealth. And we will finish bang on 5 because, you know, we finish at 5. So just in case you're setting your watches, we will be finishing at 5. So may I call the next panel to the days, please? We have Crystal Dare, who is an IP lawyer from a firm called Cause in Melbourne. Megan Davis, who is a constitutional lawyer and has got a very strong interest in The Voice. And Latika Burke, who is a journalist from the Sydney Morning Herald. I felt it was probably better for her to be interrogating them about what's going on in Australia than for me. So we have a very Aussie homegrown thing to talk about what's going on in Australia. But before we start, we're going to show you a video from a chap called Harold Thomas, who is an Indigenous artist who was part of the Stolen Generation. You may or may not know that in Australia, in living memory, Indigenous people were being abused by being taken away from their communities and educated in a European fashion. I think that those days are long gone now, but he is one of the products of that system, and he designed the Aboriginal flag, which was used first 50 years ago, just over 50 years ago, for a protest march against real estate rights in Australia, which I think most people think have been very unfair to the Indigenous people. So he is going to get, the reason that we have an interest in this, by the way, is that as a pro bono job, in the same way as we did the project for World Toilet Day and World Toilet Organization, we contributed our time free to Harold so that he could actually negotiate with the Australian government for them to buy him out of his rights. So he was paid fairly for the copyrights and intellectual property in the Aboriginal flag, which is now an official flag of Australia, which we're very pleased by. And Crystal will talk about that to start with. She'll come up to the days after the video, and then we'll hear from Megan. And then when that discussion is finished, Ed will finish the day. So with that, let's hear the video and then on to the panel. Thank you.
My name is Harold Joseph Thomas. I was born in Alice Springs in 1947. I designed the Aboriginal flag, which was first raised in Adelaide on the 9th of July 1971, for Aboriginals to stand up and say, look, enough's enough. We've had experiences that shouldn't happen in this country, but it did happen. And we stood together to march for our rights, our legal rights and our rights to the land itself. And when we talk about land with Aboriginal people, we talk about our identity. It is inextricably linked about who you are as an Aboriginal. It's your land, your identity, and with your land and identity, you're talking about sites, you're talking about the language, you're talking about the dreaming tracks. There's a whole series of material that you should understand if you're talking about Aboriginal land rights. And with that, when we had our first, when I went to the first Aboriginal Day March in 1970, there was a gathering of Aboriginals around Australia in capital cities to stand up and to be counted. Said, I'm proud, I'm Aboriginal, I'm proud I'm black, and I got something to be grateful for about our heritage and our culture. So that's possibly the centre and the reason why the Aboriginal flag came into being. Not on 1970, which the first day of March I went, but in 1971. That rings back to the past. It's like an old story now. It's 50 years old. I was 24. All the activists and people who marched at that time were very young men and women, very young. But we weren't by ourselves. We had young white folk, young men and women who stood by us at the beginning, and they are still there. So we shouldn't forget that, because the numbers are important, and that's always have stuck in my mind. So I gave those symbols of the sun, the earth, and the people a special meaning, and I did say that the Aboriginal colours of the earth, the red ochre and the yellow ochre, was foremost. That this flag was celebrating the land we love. It was at one stage called the land rights flag, but really it's an identity flag which says about land rights, which says about who we are, and which transcends a big story for all of us, that the Aboriginal identity harks back to 40,000 years. So the Aboriginal flag is a place, it's in a safe place where the Commonwealth will protect and be the custodian of it, and I like that. My family likes that, and my tribal family thinks it's a great idea, because then it's freed up, but it's freed up to be accessed for all sorts of people, all Australian people, mind you, not just Aboriginal, but it allows the Aboriginal flag to breathe a new life in itself, right? Breathe. So it becomes definitely in partnership with the Australian flag, and that I love.
Okay, well, I'm from Australia, as you know. I'm an IP lawyer. I'm a brand lawyer, and I'm very, very passionate about copyright law. My firm is Cause Chambers Westgarth. Cause is a premium independent law firm in Australia, full service law firm. We represent many of the world's most famous and important brands, and because of our independence in Australia, we work with law firms all around the world in many, many jurisdictions, and it was, I have to say, such a great honour and privilege to work so closely with Harold Thomas, who you've just heard from. Our firm worked pro bono, as David Haig mentioned, alongside Brand Finance in the context of a deal which I'll say a few more things about. But first, I wanted to pick up on a thread. I've been here since first thing this morning, and I've been absorbing and this thread about culture. And we heard from, among other people, the First Lady of the Ukraine about culture and how that manifests in the context of soft power, and you'll see it in this story, and you'll hear about it from me, and also Professor Megan Davis, who is with us as well today. So you could see in the background of the footage there of Harold one of his artworks, as well as the Aboriginal flag. And I have, I mean, not all of you may have been to Australia, and so I've brought with me the flag so you can see it. This is what it looks like in a form which is flown, and I think it's pretty special at this time for it to share the company of these 10 flags of the countries who have received the top 10 places in Brand Finance's index launched today. And so some things about Harold to give you some context. As we understand it, Harold Thomas was the first Aboriginal Australian to graduate from a university with a fine art degree. He was an artist, he is an artist. And as David mentioned, he was taken from his family at a very young age as a boy, and he moved to Adelaide, and this is where he studied fine art, and he also had a job at the Museum of Adelaide, which at the time had one of the largest collections in Australia of Indigenous art and cultural artefacts. And so there's this combination of what he absorbed through his fine art training, as well as what he absorbed in that museum, and as well as his core identity, and all of these things which contributed to this composition being the Australian Aboriginal flag, black at the top, and occasionally I've seen it flown upside down in Australia, and I've had to make a few calls to tell people to turn it around and get it the right way. And I think black as a colour is very heavy in a composition, and sometimes you would see it at the bottom for that reason. And part of the, I think, power of this flag is it the black sits at the top, and it adds, it's slightly unsettling in terms of the composition. So Harold gave us some more context as to the meaning of each of the elements of the flag. As David Haig mentioned, it began its life as a protest flag nearly 52 years ago, and what it describes is the relationship of people to land, land to culture, and culture to identity, and all of those things are interwoven. So what this flag does is very powerful. It is not passive. Its meaning and its role in our society has evolved and shifted significantly over the last 52 years, and some Australian scholars have described it as the most successful piece of public art ever created in Australia, and that's, I guess, said in the context of art as activism. The original flag, first flown, as far as we know, it doesn't exist anymore, And so what we have left is a circle which was cut out. The original version was made from sewn pieces of cloth, and we do have in Australia the original circle, which is a piece of that original fabric, and it gives us some idea of the size of the original flag, which is now, you know, ubiquitous, as ever present in our country. So there are some moments which stand out in the Australian consciousness in connection with the flag, and one of them is Cathy Freeman's gold medal in the 400 metre sprint in the 2000 Olympics, where she draped it over herself in the victory lap, but it was only a few years earlier in 1994 at the Commonwealth Games where it caused controversy when she did the same thing. In 1994, the flag had not yet been proclaimed a national flag of our country, but the celebrated Olympic moment, which I mentioned, it was seen as a moment for the nation, symbolising the Australian people's desire for reconciliation and pride in Aboriginal culture and heritage. And I mean, we're also very proud of Ash Barty and her achievements in tennis and the flag colours, which we saw in connection with that. But what I also wanted to say and point out is the many hundreds of thousands or more of equally poignant or important, less public usages of the Aboriginal flag in Australia with equal significance or weight, in my view. And so I mentioned that in 1995, this flag was proclaimed a national flag of Australia under our Flags Act. The Torres Strait Islander flag is also a national flag of our country, and where there are 3 flagpoles outside any building, all 3 national flags should be flown. And we had a situation in Australia until last year where we had a national flag which was owned by one individual but which represented a whole people. And it was in this context that our law firm chose to take on Harold Thomas as a client, and he's since become a close friend. We took this matter on pro bono as we recognised that there was a need in our country to resolve the complex legal issues which sat behind the growing Free the Flag movement in Australia in this unusual situation where copyright in a national flag remained privately held. And so what ensued was 2 years of negotiations. We were negotiating on behalf of Harold Thomas with the Commonwealth of Australia in relation to this flag and its future. There was an intervening Senate inquiry in Australia. There was a lot of press attention around it and how it was ultimately going to be resolved. And the transaction was ultimately concluded, and Harold Thomas assigned copyright, the economic rights in the flag, to the Commonwealth of Australia to be custodian of it on behalf of our peoples, and to effectively lift copyright restrictions upon it and to unfetter the flag. So this deal was announced by our then Prime Minister Scott Morrison on the 25th of January 2022, and the deal document which we co-drafted sits in our national archives as it was an important moment for our country. And what was important to Harold and to us was that there'd be a number of public interest dimensions to the deal. And one of them, I mean, when he was able to do lots of travel, Harold would go around to schools and speak to children and students about the flag and its history and his history and our country's history in connection with the flag, and he won't always be able to do that. And so what we're establishing is an informational repository to give that gift or a version of it to the future generations. There are ongoing financial contributions to NAIDOC as part of that deal, and also the establishment of a not-for-profit with $2 million of the transaction amount. And we are assisting, as a firm, we're assisting Harold to set up that not-for-profit currently, and its ambition is to make a real difference in terms of Indigenous men's and women's health objectives. I've mentioned Harold as an artist. This is part of his identity, and it has been for all this time. Harold created 50 artworks, mostly on canvas during the 50th year of the Aboriginal flag, and he gifted one of those to the Commonwealth as a gesture in connection with the deal, and that work will hang at Parliament House. And so I now wanted to just sort of segue and say a few things about what we call ICIP, or Indigenous Cultural Intellectual Property. And what I should also say in that context is that there are many, many things which are unknowable to a non-Indigenous Australian, as I am. But what I do know very, very well is intellectual property law in Australia, and what screams out to me at the moment is how our current system, copyright system, does not sit well with many First Nations traditions, and in some cases it's quite profoundly jarring. And so our first peoples possessed the land more than 60,000 years ago, and there is such a strong tradition of storytelling, oral storytelling, and art. And in Australia, we have a copyright system which we inherited from the British system, and we're also signatory to international conventions such as the Berne Convention, and what that means is that copyright only subsists for 70 years after the death of the author, as opposed to some stories and elements of Indigenous culture which are intended to have existed for tens of thousands of years and are intended to go on and on and on in that manner. And there's also concepts like a communal custodianship of stories, as opposed to this concept that an individual or a company will own copyright and monetize it for a period of time, and then the copyright expires and it enters the public domain. And so I think there's lots for our country to grapple with in that context, and it feeds into a bigger picture in our country around shifts required in the legislative landscape relating to IP. And it's not just limited to IP. We've spoken a little bit at points today around data, or what I call data, these sorts of issues are relevant to data as well, and in particular, we're starting to talk about Indigenous data sovereignty. And so I think there's one other big problem at the moment which we have, which is the proliferation in Australia of fake Indigenous art, and it's disrespectful, and frankly it's damaging to culture. And I think all of this fits within what we've been speaking about in terms of an ESG, and in particular the S in ESG, and it also relates to human rights. And of course, one of the things that's most prominently spoken about in Australia at the moment is the Uluru Statement and the Voice to Parliament in Australia. And Professor Davis will provide much more detailed context for that in a minute. But what I wanted to say is that, I've read the Uluru Statement. Our firm is a signatory, was one of the first law firms to be signatory to the Uluru Statement, and I've read that statement over and over, and reading it with my IP lawyer hat on, I wanted to read out one line of it which stood out to the IP lawyer in me and as profound, and it's to the effect that our children will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. And my comment about this is that too long in Australia there has been a denial and destruction of culture, and as a country, preservation and continuance of First Nations culture is so critically important. And I'll wrap there and hand over to Professor Davis.
Thank you. I've been asked to talk about the Aboriginal voice to Parliament. I should note that I'm a Cobble Cobble woman of the Barringam Nation in southwest Queensland. This year, at the end of 2023, Australia will be heading to the ballot box to vote in a referendum on the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, or First Nations, in the Australian Constitution. A referendum is the mechanism by which an alteration can be made to the text of the Australian Constitution, a written document that came into force in 1901. Since 1901, there have been 8 alterations to the Australian Constitution out of 44 attempts. Of course, not all of those attempts to change the Constitution deserve to pass. The main reason the failure record is so high is that Australians generally vote no to the expansion of federal power. For a written constitution, the Australian Constitution is one of the most rigid texts in the world. The threshold for a successful alteration to the text is very high, a national majority and a majority of states. This will be the first time Australia has gone to a referendum in 24 years. The last successful attempt occurred in 1977, 46 years ago. The last referendum held was on the question of whether Australia should become a republic. That referendum, held in 1999, failed dismally as a majority of Australians voted to retain the constitutional monarchy. Australia's constitution is famously known as Australia has been remarked in relation to constitutional change as a frozen continent. I was just out of law school and I was living in Geneva, working for the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights when the Republic referendum was held in 1999. Not long after the Republic referendum vote, I spoke to many of my Aboriginal elders and leaders, and I discovered that I was probably the only Aboriginal person in Australia who voted yes. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders visiting the United Nations in Geneva at the time would say that an Australian republic could not come before addressing what we call in Australia unfinished business. This business is what people refer to as the unresolved grievance, or the original grievance, that Australia was dispossessed and there was no treaty. Others said becoming a republic would cede our Aboriginal sovereignty. It was the 1999 referendum that made me interested in this question: can we become a republic before we address unfinished business? It is in part why I became a constitutional lawyer. Many Australians in the late 90s and early 2000s, and still say to me in response to that question, get a republic up first and deal with Indigenous issues later. But as Australian historian Mark McKenna expounded in his 2004 book, This Country, A Reconciled Republic, the matter isn't that simple. He says it's neither rational nor just to replace the sovereignty of the Crown without addressing the constitutional position of Aboriginal Australians. It is not an abstract question about the past, it is about the legacy of that non-recognition and the 200 years of non-recognition that has followed. The dispossession, the massacres, the paternalism, the protection era, the racially discriminatory laws, and that very lengthy period of compulsory racial segregation, the upheaval in Aboriginal societies across the country. All of that flows from the untruthful nature of that first act of annexation in 1788. The Crown, the monarch, a republic and Aboriginal sovereignty are all issues raised over the past decade as the nation has moved towards this 2023 referendum. So constitutional recognition has been on the table since the Republic referendum in 1999, where there was multi-party support for symbolic recognition of First Nations people in a preamble to the Australian Constitution. In 2011, former Prime Minister Julia Gillard kick-started the formal constitutional recognition project in Australia, led by the federal government and successive federal governments following, to move towards the constitutional referendum that we're having this year. We are now in 2023, which is the second decade of recognition. We have had 7 formal federal mandated processes, 10 reports, 6 prime ministers over the course of that first decade. This is a lot of public policy work, and now in the 12th year we are going to referendum. The proposal on the table is a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament and the government of the day. It is predicated upon the importance of having First Nations communities' input into the development of laws and policies made about communities and about our lives as a distinct cultural group. The proposal for a constitutional voice to Parliament was one that arose from a 2-year process in Australia under a referendum council that was established by Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. It emerged from a constitutional process that was led and designed by First Nations people, and it included a First Nations regional deliberative dialogue process in which 12 constitutional dialogues were conducted across the nation, culminating in a final meeting at Uluru in mid-2017. At the final Constitutional Convention, the Uluru Statement from the Heart was issued to the Australian people as an invitation to the Australian people to help First Nations to persuade the Canberra political elite and politicians and the 2 major parties that this reform is worthwhile. The constitutional change emerged the idea for this constitutional change emerged during a period of acute policy and law reform inertia at a Commonwealth level in Australia. It culminated in the 2022 federal election, where for the first time in Australia's history, the primary vote of both major political parties plummeted to the 30s. The 3 major issues at the election last year was more action on climate change, a federal integrity commission to address corruption at a federal level, and the implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The failure of the Australian government to close the gap in the huge disparity between living standards and disadvantage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the mainstream population is one of the driving forces behind the exigency of a voice. Since 1967, where the last referendum was held, or should I say the most successful referendum was held in Australia's history to allow the federal government to have the competency to pass laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the federal parliament has always needed a representative body of First Nations people to consult with in the Indigenous Affairs portfolio. The problem is that each body created is then promptly abolished from one government to the next. And when that happens, policy settings are abolished, infrastructure is withdrawn, and communities have to start from scratch. It is difficult for Aboriginal communities to plan for the future and plan economic development because rather than building on the strengths of communities to develop and plan, governments, parliaments and bureaucrats keep dragging communities back to the starting line and hamper any progress that is made. Another deep-rooted problem that was identified across Australia in all of the constitutional dialogues was the non-existent engagement of the Commonwealth bureaucracy with communities. It was felt that bureaucrats fly in and fly out and organise tick and flick sessions of consultation and never really engage with communities on the solutions that are needed to drive change. The lack of input into the development and rollout of policies is what leads to poor outcomes in many communities. The bureaucrats who mostly live in Canberra and in state and territory cities are far removed from the communities they are meant to work with. Over 12 years of a Commonwealth policy setting called Closing the Gap, we have seen minuscule gains. The bureaucracy and successive governments have failed in their responsibility to the Australian people and the Indigenous communities for their mishandling of the Indigenous Affairs portfolio. The constitutional component of a voice to Parliament is that it mandates or compels the government and the Parliament to listen to what communities are saying. A voice will mean that government will have better quality information about the situation in First Nations communities because they have to consult them. Detailed and nuanced information from communities themselves will result in better laws and policies and mean resource allocation is more accurately targeted. Better laws mean improved outcomes across all metrics, including health, housing, criminal justice and education. It is not the intention of the proposal to limit the legislative power of the Commonwealth Parliament, but rather to provide where such power is exercised in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that they have provided appropriate input by way of advice and consultation. So the exigency of the voice to Parliament is that the status quo is not working for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Closing the gap is not working, and in many indicators we are going backwards. So the voice to Parliament emerged from the Uluru Statement from the Heart that was issued at this final constitutional convention at Uluru. And after all that has happened, the question that was put to each of the dialogues was, what does repair look like? And the answer was a voice, an enhanced role in the democratic decision-making of the Australian state. When we ran the First Nations constitutional dialogues, as I said, a process aimed at eliciting from communities what meaningful constitutional recognition may look like to them, many of our people were deeply cynical, and they deserved to be cynical. We had to say each day that the law reform is an exercise in imagination. It requires you to exercise your imagination that the nation can change. Suspend your disbelief that you won't be heard. These men and women of the Uluru Dialogues came from communities where they are voiceless and powerless. They gave up their weekend to think about how to improve Australian democracy, not just for them, but for all Australians. So this constitutional dialogue process was an Australian innovation. First Nations were never consulted on the original Australian Constitution, nor since. And the Uluru Statement from the Heart is an innovation, unlike the bark petitions of old, where we would hand the bark petitions to Prime Ministers. They would put them behind perspex and hang them on the walls of Parliament House. The Uluru Dialogues were run in a way that we wanted to ensure that the decision-making of the dialogues privileged our elders. Aboriginal communities are collectives, but they're also gerontocracies, meaning our elders, our old people, our traditional owners are the cultural authority of our communities. So 60% of all invitations to every dialogue was issued to the elders. And they made a decision at The Rock to not present the Uluru Statement from the Heart to politicians, to the Prime Minister and the many politicians who were going to come to Uluru that day. Because it was decided that this was not about politicians. This was about Australians working together, like what had happened in 1967 to achieve the highest yes vote in Australian history. At Uluru, our elders said we are going to talk directly to the Australian people and we're going to animate their agency and ask them to use their voice to help get this reform across the line. It might seem like a Pollyanna endeavour, but what our elders wanted to do was circumvent retail Australian politics, which is about set positions, set ideology, tribalism, and the old left and right will not get us there. The Constitution is meant to change. It is built to change by the Australian people. So it was a strategy of soft power for hard law. It's been 5 years since the Uluru Statement was issued, and the literature always told us that the key factor in successful transformative constitutional change around the world is a leader, a transformative leader with courage. In 2022, the nation elected Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, and his first commitment as Prime Minister was a referendum for a voice to Parliament. This reform has been endorsed as a best practice mechanism by the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples at the United Nations, the United Nations Human Rights Council, and the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And so we have a leader of courage and vision who has now committed to doing what no Prime Minister has been able to do before him. I want to conclude by reading to you what many of our elders did call an olive branch, a hand of friendship that was issued to the Australian people in 2017 that has now resulted in a referendum to be held at the end of this year. This is the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land, or Mother Nature, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That peoples possessed the land for 60 millennia and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are aliened from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement-making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country, and we invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. Thank you.
While Megan is taking her chair, Crystal, I thought I'd just ask you, because it's kind of hard to believe that in our living memory in this room, that the journey from the creation of the flag to freeing the copyright to seeing it last year for the first time flown above the Sydney Harbour Bridge has happened. Do you think it's been too slow?
I think there was a period of time at the beginning of its life, for the first decade or so, where it would be, its existence would be inconsistent with a Commonwealth custodianship. And then time marched on, and as an IP lawyer, you know, from time to time, we see our clients get in trouble when IP is an afterthought, and sometimes it can be very costly. And I think there was a point in time in 1995 when the flag became, it was proclaimed a national flag of our country, but the copyright at that point was not dealt with, and I think it could or should have been dealt with in 1995.
Megan, thank you so much for your speech there. As you mentioned, there's been some cynicism within the First Nations community itself about this whole process. Is the Indigenous community united on what's going forward now this year?
Well, my first answer is the Indigenous community is no different to the Australian community, right? We have a parliament that its entire work is predicated on people's different ideas of the good life, right? So Aboriginal people don't agree on everything. What we know from the polling over the past 6 years and from the involvement of First Nations people is that 80%, Reconciliation Australia says 88%, of our people support the reform. But it's the nature of media that the emphasis is put on the people that say they don't want it. And that's what's happening in Australia at the moment.
The other barrier to referendum succeeding in Australia or not is whether it enjoys bipartisan support. And you already mentioned the very high barriers for success. That's looking unlikely in this case. What argument do you fear most from the critics of The Voice that might be successful?
I don't know. I mean, look, bipartisanship, the last successful referendum was 47 years ago. So everybody that comes at us saying, well, you need bipartisanship because that's the secret ingredient for a successful referendum, I don't think anyone really believes that in this day and age. I mean, we're about to have a referendum it's the first referendum in the era of social media. And the other thing is that in terms of the records of polling of Australians in terms of their trust in Australian institutions, back in 47 years ago, politicians were at the top of that list. Today, they're at the bottom. We just had an election that really, I think, demonstrated the lack of faith Australians have in politicians to govern in a way that they want. And so I just don't think the notion of bipartisanship really applies to the situation in Australia right now. What we know from what's happening with the Liberal National Party, or at least the Liberal Party, is that they're likely to allow a conscience vote.
And do you think that will be enough to rally the necessary support in the community?
I think the support in the community is there now. So they either choose to join or they don't. It's really up to them.
So if we asked you to place a bet today, you're confident of victory?
Yeah, of course I am. I wouldn't be here. Of course I am.
And
it's polled at 60% quite consistently for 5 years. Now that we're having a robust national debate, there's a bit of slippage from hard yes to soft yes, but it's still holding really firm.
one of the problems that is coming up is this requirement for more detail, this desire from the community for more detail about exactly how the voice will work. Who would sit on the voice, for example? How would you prevent it from being politically stacked as governments change? This sort of level of detail, which so far hasn't been forthcoming. And as I think Paul Keating once famously said, if you don't understand it, don't vote for it. Are you concerned about how that campaign is progressing this year?
No, because there's been, people have been asking for detail since Albanese was elected, like literally the next day. He's set up a process with 3 committees, and those committees are working on detail. I don't understand why the media doesn't understand that, but that detail will come out when the bill's stood up. As for the 16 questions that the opposition leaders asked, referendums are different to, the ordinary theatre of Parliament, meaning what we're asking Australians to vote on is the right to be consulted on laws and policies. That yes at a referendum opens the door to the Parliament to do its bread and butter work of putting together the bricks and mortar or the operating manual or whatever you want to call it, the detail of the voice. But before that work can be done, we have to go out and consult with First Nations peoples, of course, about what they think a constitutional voice should look like. So there's really compelling reasons as to why we're just not racing out and saying, hey, it's 16 members and hey, it's this. I mean, there's a parliamentary process that's in place with parliamentary committees where this work will be done. But we're not asking Australians to vote on a Model A or a Model B. We're asking them to vote on the principle because that's what constitutions are for. They're for principle.
And if you think the voice, just say, didn't succeed, do you think that would damage Australia's reputation internationally?
I don't contemplate that it's not going to succeed, and I'm not going to make guesses about what it'll do to Australia's reputation, because I think it'll succeed.
And why are you so confident?
I've been working on this for 12 years. I mean, it hasn't come out of nowhere. Aboriginal people have been asking for some form of recognition for 3 to 4 decades. And the Australian government has put the offer on the table 12 years ago. As I said, there's been a lot of processes that have been in place. And in the past 5 years, we've been working with the Australian community on the Uluru Statement and why it's needed. So we've done all the work that we think is needed. We know that at some point it enters the kind of robust theatre of politics, but there's a lot of cynicism among Australians about retail Australian politics, which just takes really important ideas of policy reform and it just deteriorates into bickering between politicians. And as you saw at the last election, I think most Australians are sick of that.
Yeah, and I think the community's had to actually ask politicians to take a step back a bit from this campaign because of exactly what you're saying. Are you concerned that politicians might actually stuff this up?
Who knows? I mean, what can you say about politicians? I mean, they're focused on the next election, right?
Yeah.
But I think by and large, most of them are of good faith, including a large number of the Liberal Party, and there's still members of the National Party who want to support it. But I think by and large, right across the country, you've got mostly Labor governments who will all campaign for the voice. I think that support from politicians will be there. But I mean, one of the things the conversation that we're having with Australians is, don't let retail Australian politics stop this reform.
And how will the voice succeed in closing the gap that you talked about?
Well, I think
other bodies have not.
Yeah, I just think one of the problems we have probably post ATSIC is that the government or the bureaucracy they don't consult First Nations people, and I think people find that really hard to believe. But up until about 4 years ago, there wasn't even an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander member of the senior bureaucracy that runs the Indigenous affairs. So, a lot of the policies, a lot of the funding is just poorly directed, but it's not hitting the ground. I think the Productivity Commission in Australia found that less than 27% of the billions of dollars that churn out of the Australian government to Indigenous communities to address disadvantage don't actually reach Indigenous communities. So there's a big industry that is built around Aboriginal disadvantage, and so there's a lot of people with a lot of skin in the game in this space. But in terms of well-directed, well-designed policies and regulatory frameworks, they just don't invite the input of the communities that know communities and that need to have that input.
And finally, Megan, just to flip the other question, when your referendum succeeds as you believe it will that enhance Australia's reputation abroad? And secondly, do you think you can then go for the Republic and a Republic becomes a slam dunk after that point?
It will enhance Australia's reputation, presumably. I mean, it's no mean feat to change a constitution, and certainly in the area of Indigenous rights, Australia doesn't fare very well. And so people are watching very closely. It's quite an interesting approach. to Indigenous rights that's very Australian. So on the Republic, who knows? I mean, sometimes it does seem like a very kind of bourgeois preoccupation in Australia. And so, but on the flip side, it also seems really silly, given we have such a robust democracy, to still entertain the idea of a constitutional monarchy. So I think it's probably inevitable. I don't know what the polling looks like, to be honest, right now. But I do think we need to re-engage the Australian population, because I think at the last Republic referendum, the majority of Australians in each state and territory were Australian-born people, and that's not the case anymore. The census data shows Australia is a rapidly browning country, and in 10 years, the old white guard will not be around. And so we're a very different country now. And so we need to re-engage Australian communities on what republicanism means, because I'm not sure the kind of model of the dominant Australian Republican movement is a model that really inspires Australians. So I think we need to have that conversation again. What does it look like? But by and large, I think Australians would support that a head of state has to be Australian.
And on that note, we'll finish our panel. Thank you, ladies.